part one was kind of broad overview, right? So we kind of hit some of those big pieces of upper room, lower room. We talked through just some discipleship, some of the problems that are out there when we think about starting college ministry. What we're going to do over the next few minutes is really begin to dissect and build out kind of our process. And so this is the process that we work through with different churches. And so what we're going to do is we're going to go through the different steps. After each of those steps, we'll just kind of stop for a question and answer time, right? So if there's anything that you're thinking or need clarification on, we'll be able to do that. And so hopefully we'll have to go a little bit faster than we went last time because we had to rush through the last two.
45 minutes on the first two.
Yeah.
And 15 minutes on the last.
Yeah. So
that's why you come to the last session.
that's right. That's right. It's our warm-up session. So let's jump into kind of really the first steps are prerequisites. And so this is one of the things that we talk through with churches of just asking the question, do they have the things in place ultimately to start a college ministry? Just because somebody comes up to you and says, hey, I got this great idea, we should really do this thing, doesn't necessarily mean that the pieces... Really that's what it usually is. Like, I got a great idea, you go implement this idea that I have, right? And so there's a couple things that we really want to see when it comes to some prerequisites when we're thinking about... when we're thinking about really kind of starting a college ministry. Number one is, we talked about this earlier this morning, is like who's the person that's going to take lead in it, right? So one of the things that Ben had mentioned, that we always want to think about team, but in the midst of that team, there is often somebody who's the driver to that vision to at least get it off the ground. Now, that's one of the pieces we talk about, is just because somebody might be like the starting off leader doesn't mean that they're the leader long term, right? That it could be somebody at some point as the ministry grows and develops, like somebody else might need to come in, and then there's kind of reordering of leadership. And so we want to see that leader and who that leader is. Then we want to begin to understand is like, is there a burden, right? It's one thing to have an idea, but it's another thing to think about, like, is there a burden? And in that is asking the question, in that burden, where are the conversations happening, and are there resources and things that can happen in order to help launch that college ministry and move forward? Now, here's the thing is, you don't necessarily have to have a budgeted item, like a line to start a college ministry. Ben and myself have both bootstrapped a couple ministries with just like our own money and people who would give a few bucks here and there, so you can do it. But you need to know that going in, right? Is this a thing that ultimately that the church is going to get behind? Are they going to come alongside of us? Is there some support in terms of staff or administration or some of those pieces that's going to help as you begin to think forward? And then even in that, is there a burden that's leading to like prayer? Is there a burden that's actually ultimately helping us move towards some of those pieces? And so what we want to see is some of those kind of prerequisites in place on that. And so, for those of you who are starting a college ministry, it might take some time to get there, right? It might take some time to hit some of these pieces in place and moving forward. Anything you want to add on that at all? Okay, any questions on kind of prerequisites at all? Hunter?
So, theoretically, if someone's working at a church and starting a college ministry, how do you navigate whenever the church doesn't see like your vision for the college ministry, where we're in a college city, we're in a city, not a college town, and so they don't see as much of the need as you do. Where I see we have 450,000 college students in the Houston area, but they're like, well, we're not a college town, so we don't really want to put the effort into it.
So what I would say is I think that there's kind of check marks along the way that you have to hit in order to kind of progress towards the next thing. So you don't necessarily need the entire church or leadership to catch a vision to say, yes, this needs to happen. And so you can initially kind of get some things going, but in order of like, if you want that ministry to continue to develop you need to continually bring them in on that conversation. Like bring the key voices, and that could be board members, that could be, executive pastors, that could be some key people. And so what I would say is you don't necessarily need 100% buy-in to start something, but as you move down the field on that, there's going to be points where you're going to want them to have greater ownership, greater understanding of what you're trying to do that will allow you go to the next level. So I'll give you I'll step back and kind of do a high-level overview of our process. So we're talking about stage 0, which is starting something from scratch. In our stage 1 coaching process, that's building a foundation and leaders. Now, you can probably move to that next level without much buy-in from church. The next stage is vision and strategy. So now we're going to say we're going to set the vision for the next 3 to 5 years. That's pretty tough to do without people who are behind that in the rest of the church. So there's certain kind of points along the way that you might get stuck if you can't navigate those. So I would just say understand kind of what those checkpoints are, and then understand, like, if we're going to progress beyond that down there, once we get there, I'm going to need to invite more people into those conversations.
Yeah, just as a general comment towards the vision piece, I think building awareness is a huge thing for people. A lot of the people you're saying, they're like, we're not a college town, there's not that many students here. And you, as like someone who's focused on that, you're like, okay, I know all this data. Probably they don't know the data. Can you give them the data? Can you give them opportunities to get exposed to the actual need?
And that really goes into the first step of what we'll talk about here. We'll start with a metaphor, though, before I talk details. So, I live in North Dakota, very different weather than Texas. Over lunch, I was talking with some students who are here, and they were asking me questions about what it's like to live in North Dakota, how do people survive, all that stuff. Like, I was legitimately, one of the guys asked, what kind of jacket do you wear? Like, what's your favorite kind of jacket? Because I was talking about how we had about 32 days or so a couple years ago where it did not get above 0 in December and January. Yeah, I like it, honestly. But so, very different than here. And if you took a house that someone would build here in Dallas, Texas, or Austin, or really anywhere in the South, and built the same house in Fargo, North Dakota, you could live in the house. Like during the summertime, it might actually save you some money because, like, build it with brick or whatever, it's going to hold in the cool of the night a little bit better. But during the wintertime, you're either going to die or you're going to spend a whole lot of resources, like money, energy, time, on keeping that house livable because it doesn't have the insulation. The power grid that you guys have down here is not built for sustaining houses heating themselves like we have up in the north. That's what happens a lot of times in ministry, is we copy paste ministry and say that's working over there in that context and bring it over here. And we're like, man, it's not working. It takes so much energy, so much time. Why is this not working? It works over there. And the problem is you built a Texan house in North Dakota. Or leaving the metaphor behind, you're trying to lead something like a leader who you are not. Like, it's something that you copy and paste from somewhere else is only going to work to the extent that your context is like their context and your leadership is like that person's leadership. So discerning your context is absolutely foundational, fundamental. And I think this is a step that so often gets skipped. We just, as leaders, we kind of just assume that we know the context. Like, yeah, I've been here for 4 years, or I went to school here, or I grew up in this church, I grew up in this town. You may know the context, but odds are there are pieces of that you don't know. One final, just to use the Bible on you, if God, who knows everything, chooses, Jesus could have become a human at the age of 30, just dove right into ministry, done it, and been like, awesome, now I did it, right? He would have had all the knowledge in the world, but for some reason, and I think there's real legitimate, theologically grounded reasons, God chose for Jesus to be born as an infant, experience life as a human, and not start ministry at the age of 2, but start ministry at the age of 30-something and minister for just a couple years. So apparently God saw some sort of value in Jesus having experience and understanding tangibly of the context in which he was going to minister. I think if Jesus needs to do that, we probably need to do that too. So discerning your context, that's a key piece. And here's how we help leaders do this. So step number 1 is prayer and presence. You need to start with prayer, right? Everything begins with prayer biblically, because the reality is it's not us doing the work. God's the one doing the work of starting a ministry. We get to be his instruments for that. So 2 practical ways you can do that. 1, go prayer walk. If you're trying to reach a college campus and you have not gone and prayer walked around that campus, get your butt out the door and do that. Number 2, we talked about this a little bit briefly this morning in one of our sessions, is a thing that we call silent evangelism. So this is not about evangelizing other people. This is about letting the Holy Spirit evangelize your heart for the people that you're called to reach. So what that looks like is setting a chunk of time, or maybe multiple chunks of time, to be physically present in the place where the people you're wanting to reach are. So if it's a college campus you're wanting to reach, that means get on that college campus. If it's young adults in your city, where are those young adults hanging out? Is it a downtown space? Is it a park? Is it the mall area, a coffee shop, whatever? Be physically present and prayerfully observe what's going on. So what I encourage leaders to do is bring a notebook with, prayerfully observe, pray for people as they walk by. Maybe think about, like, man, what's that person's life story? You observe the interactions that's taken place. And if the Spirit leads you, go talk to someone, whatever. But that's not the goal. You don't have to do that part. The goal is for you to be there and to observe and get a sense of what type of people are in this place. How do they interact? What's the culture here? So that's part number 1 of discerning the context. Part number 2 is figure out what the current ministry landscape is, which looks like, Google it, college ministries in my city, call the churches in your city, sit down and have coffee and conversation with other people who are doing ministry that's trying to reach the same age group. And that's going to be hugely helpful for you. That's part 2 of discerning your context. Part 3 is about discovering what are the needs and the opportunities. So a really helpful little tool to do this. This is not something we created. It's taken from a book called The Forgotten Ways by Alan Hirsch. Talks about, and he stole it from someone else who I'm forgetting. He attributes the person, I forget their name though. He talks about the 5 P's of context. And these are questions. I'll just write the initial word. So there's parties, pain, pennies, persons of peace, and forgetting one. Power, yeah. So you can use, and I'll talk through the questions, and we can easily send out these, if you want the PDF that outlines this, or you can go buy the book, The Forgotten Ways, and find it in there. It's a great book. Not an easy read, but it's a great book. So parties is about where are the celebrations in our context, and how can we join in with them? Right, if like a common thing that a lot of campus ministries do by default, that is doing this, is right. Most colleges, campuses have like a welcome week where they have all this, celebrations, events. Your campus ministries do that one pretty well, but not very often do we identify what other parties and celebrations are going on, and how can we join in with them. Rather than creating our own parties, let's join the parties that are there and bring the gospel to those places. Number 2 is pain. What are the pain points in our city? Where are people frustrated or angry or hurt? And what does the gospel have to say about that? And how do we respond to that? Pennies is about money. Who's the rich? Who's the poor in our context? And what does the gospel have to say about that? And how do we respond? Persons of peace. Are you guys familiar with that term? So I'll explain it just in case. Persons of peace, I believe it's the Gospel of Mark. Jesus talks about, he sends his disciples out ahead of him to the cities and says, find someone who's going to welcome you and host you and stay with them. And if they reject you, you can kick off the dust and move on to the next place. That's the passage that this phrase, person of peace, is taken from. It's really about someone who's going to offer their resources and their relational network for you to bring the gospel to bear. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to become a Christian. It means that they are willing to open the door. Like I think of my wife and I have a friend who's nominally Catholic. She's from Peru, Spanish speaking, and she's this person of peace for us. She's not a Christian. She comes to a lot of the ministry stuff that we do, and is open, asks questions, but just hasn't encountered Jesus yet. And we're kind of like, come on, Jesus, wake this girl up. Like, she's had great conversations, but what she has done, there's all these other, Spanish-speaking women, most of them women who like married North Dakota men and aren't particularly happy about it now that they're in North Dakota, because they're from like Peru and Brazil and all this stuff. Like, it's -30, why are we here? But she'll like invite us to come to her friends' kids' birthday parties, or like invite them to the grill outs we do. So she's opening up this relational network for us that we would have zero access to if it wasn't for her. That's a good example of person of peace. Power is about who are the powerful, who are the powerless. What does the gospel have to say about that? If you can ask those questions and answer them well for your context, it's going to become pretty clear what your next step is in ministry. If you're getting stuck on like, man, how do we do this ministry? What should discipleship look like? What should our weekly gathering look like? Whatever. Odds are you probably have not done enough context work. Because if you understand the work of context and have, like our next point, it's going to be biblical discipleship going on, understanding of that, it's going to be pretty clear about what's our next step. So that's what oftentimes I'll point leaders back to. What's the context piece? Have you done the work there? Do you understand the cultural narratives? Do you understand the struggles, the pain, the opportunities, the problems? And if you do that, you can probably know here's where the gospel needs to come to bear in the place that God's put us. Yeah, I'll end with that.
Okay. One story that I shared last time, and I'll share this time again, is one of the realities is no matter what city or context that we're coming in, it has kind of undercurrents in that city, right? There's things that you're going to consistently bump up against. There's going to be things that are going to be challenges as you're discipling people. There's going to be things that you're going to have to navigate. One of the stories that I shared was a few years ago as a ministry, we had some kind of target cities that we wanted to reach, and one of those cities was Duluth, Minnesota. So Duluth is right on Lake Superior. And for some reason, for probably 18 to 24 months, I just could not crack the code on building a relationship with a church there. Really wanted to kind of build relationship, find a key open door. So I'm sitting down with a pastor friend of mine, and he's like, you know why you're having a problem, right? And I'm like, no. He's like, do you want to know? And I'm like, yeah, why don't you share with me? And so he began to share with me a little bit about the history of Duluth. He said back in the 40s and the 50s, mining was a huge, huge deal in northern Minnesota. They have iron ore. And so Duluth became a major import for mining. And so as this is happening, people from all across the region are taking note and saying, we can make some money there. Right, so there's people moving from Minneapolis and Milwaukee and Chicago, and they're setting up, businesses and industry there because they're an opportunity to make a ton of money. Well, over the next couple of decades, mining began to dry up, right? So it begins to be not as big a deal. Iron ore mines begin to be less and less, and slowly all the different people who move there to make money begin to pull their businesses out, right? Leaving Duluth, like, kind of sad. It's kind of like a sad city. And what happened because of that, and he began to share this with me, he said, because that happened, Duluth as a city became very untrusting of outsiders. Like, they just didn't trust people, because then they said, well, if you're in us, if you're in the city, you're a part of us, and if you're outside, you're not. And so I'm bumping up against all these people, and what they're looking at me as an outsider, that I'm not a part of the city, right? And so it was interesting as I'm like engaging in this conversation of like, man, that would have been good to know like 24 months ago, right? As I'm building relationships. And I say that because your city has some of those same things. Right? There's undercurrents of those the part of your city that you're going to be navigating all the time, right? There's going to be things that are embedded into the culture that you're going to have to figure out as you build relationships with people, okay?
So any questions on context before we move on to the next piece?
You mentioned a website in the last session. What website was that?
Yeah, datausa.io is a great website for getting basic like demographic data. So you can put in a campus name and it'll tell you how many students are enrolled in the campus, what their main majors are, I think it even touches on the median income of graduates, other stuff like that. You do it for cities as well, and it's pretty comprehensive. There's some campuses, some cities that it's missing data on, but it's a great starting place for general demographic data.
Yeah. And I told the group last session on part 2 that I'll try to, since most of you, I have your email from that download on the first session, I'll try to send out the 5 Ps for you guys so you can have the PDF on that. It'd be a great resource. Cool.
Just one more comment on context. I think the default, getting the demographic kind of big picture data is the easy part, but what is going to be much more valuable is having actual conversations with people who are outside of your immediate church context. So go stand outside of the coffee shop and ask anyone who looks like a college student or young adult, hey, can I ask you 2 questions? What frustrates you about being a young adult in the city? Or where's somewhere that you like to, what's some celebration or something you like to do, or whatever. You pick, there's questions you can create out of that, but 2 or 3 questions, that will tell you way more about your context and the needs and opportunities there than 5 hours of online research.
Yeah. Some of the kind of homework assignments that we give on this one, we talked about prayer walking, silent evangelism, interviewing other ministry leaders in your city to find out what they're doing, as well as interviewing college students and young adults to kind of hear their story and what some of the things are of the campus. So those would be kind of a few things that would help you really kind of discern your context. Okay, let's jump into the next step, which is really around this idea of starting to make disciples. We had mentioned this earlier this morning, is that, man, we really want to lead with discipleship. The temptation so much, and we're going to keep saying this, the temptation is start something simple, right? Let's just get something off the ground so it's visible, so people can see that we're actually doing something. But really what we want to begin to see is starting with disciple making. And one of the challenges, I think, that we see consistently, that at least I see consistently, and I'm sure Ben does too, is the definition of discipleship or disciple making. I mean, we can be in a room and you can have however many people are in there, you can have different definitions of what discipleship is, right? So it's kind of like helping yourself and your leadership and the students or the college students and the young adults in your community to really understand disciple making in a biblical way. I want to give you kind of a couple analogies that I use for this. Number one is I want you to think about disciple making as being a road, right? So on the road, though, that there's 2 ditches, a ditch on each side. One ditch is what I call the programmatic ditch. And what I mean by the programmatic ditch is that discipleship equals getting them to a group, right? So if I can just get them to a group or get them in a missional community or get them whatever, that then I can somehow check off the box and that we can equate that as discipleship. And we know, or should know, that just because somebody is in a group doesn't mean that they're being discipled, right? They can be a part of a small group and discipleship can be absent. But on the other side of the road is another ditch, and I call that the organic ditch. And what I mean by organic ditch is like that we don't create any definition. So let's say Hunter comes to me and says, hey, we have this student over here in Houston, and I want you to disciple Joe. And I'm like, okay, Hunter, how often do you want me to meet with him? Well, I don't know, just kind of meet with him. Well, what do I say? Well, I don't know, just kind of whatever you want to. Well, what do I do? Well, it becomes this this kind of abstract thing that we don't really know what it is, right? So what I would say is that there's a balance between those 2 things of saying, how do we create structures so that people can understand what discipleship is, right? But also a little bit of kind of relational fluidity in that, so there's some spontaneity in that and helping your people. So that's kind of one analogy I'll use. The other one is I'll ask on a strategy session with somebody from a church. I'll say, your vehicle for discipleship, and I'll have listened to what it is, and it could be a small group, it could be a Sunday school class, it could be a missional community, mentoring, whatever. I'll ask them, is that the end point or the doorway for discipleship? And what I mean by that is is the point to get them into that group where then I can check that off? Or is that group just a doorway for discipleship really to happen? And what I mean by that is let's say Ben and I and Hunter, we're in a group, right? And I'm discipling them. And in that, I'm listening in the conversation of what God is doing in Ben and Hunter's life, right? And in that, it's like, man, I need to follow up with Ben about that because, man, I just want to kind of encourage him in that area. And Hunter said that he's got finals happening on Friday, so I want to text him on Friday morning and let him know I'm praying for him. Or like, how am I going to like invite these guys out to eat or hang out and watch the NBA finals? So what I'm viewing that group as is functionally a doorway for discipleship, right? That I actually want to help me and my leaders say, we want you to be involved in the group, but we want you to go beyond the group. We want you to do some things and really seeing that as a doorway. So thinking about defining biblically is a key thing when we talk about starting with discipleship. Secondly, though, in that is understanding that discipleship is prior to leadership. Here's what I mean by that in two ways. Number one is you as a leader. We talked about upper room, lower room this morning. The key is I want to make sure that leader is actively discipling other people before they ever start something, right? So are they meeting with students? Are they engaging with them? But secondly, is that we want that to become a lens in which they invite people into leadership, right? Here's what we do often, is we ask people to commit to leadership, like, hey, who wants to be a leader here? Whoever raises their hand, okay. So, you're going to be in charge of soundboard, you're going to plan events, you're going to do all these things. And, oh, by the way, we want you to disciple people as well. We actually need to flip those things around of just saying the first call is discipleship. And then as you're discipling people, we want to help position you to have influence in leadership. So how do we have discipleship that actually precedes leadership, both as we're starting a ministry, but also as we think about those leaders who are coming into contact with us and going to be the future leaders as well. So think about defining it biblically, thinking about preceding leadership. And then really the third one here is making sure that the system or structure addresses the heart of disciple making. And I don't think I said this in the last session. This is something that's really critical for us as a ministry, is helping understand that really discipleship is an invitation into relationship that's been modeled and that we've been invited into with God, right? So think about like a passage like John chapter 17 is the big one we always talk about, is in that high priestly prayer, Jesus is saying, man, Father, I love you, you love me, this love is so good that I actually want to invite other people into this relationship that you and I have. And actually, as they get invited in, they're going to invite other people into that relationship as well. And so to think about even the structure and a system that fosters really what discipleship is, in its essence, should be an overflow of your love relationship with the Lord, right? That's spilling out into the people around you and that you're inviting them, saying, this is so good that I want you to experience it as well. So thinking about...
A comment on that, I think this is a challenge, especially that last point, because I think a lot of times we'll create a system for discipleship and then put people in there to run the system who haven't experienced or caught the love of Jesus. So you got people who are trying to disciple people into something they've never experienced themselves. Yeah. Like I think of ministry I led for a lot of years. We actually, one of the reasons we shut our ministry down is we realized, man, the leaders that we've been working with for the last 2 years, and these people I've been friends with for several years and still really love them, but it was like, they don't know the love of Jesus. That's not a judgment necessarily about whether or not they're saved, but they were working really hard for God. And that was not fueled by oh man, I'm so in love with Jesus that I just can't help but do it. It was like, this is what I'm supposed to do because I grew up in church and I know that I'm supposed to make disciples because I keep being told that over and over again. Yeah. So we need to really watch out and make sure, man, is what we're creating a system where we're just saying, hey, let's make this so dumb that people can do this without Jesus and without the power of the Holy Spirit, or are we actually creating a system that's dependent on
people knowing Jesus in a real way, where like John 17 says, like, man, Father, I love you so much, and I love these people so much that I want to invite them into our love. And when they encounter that, they're going to go and tell everyone else. Because that's, like, what else would you do? When you really love Marvel movies, you get excited when you talk about Marvel movies, and when a new Marvel movie comes out, you're like, guys, let's go to the Marvel movie. But sadly, that's not the experience that most people have around Christianity.
Yeah. So questions on this one when we think about this idea of starting with disciple making.
What would you say? So like my church that I'm at, I like was brought in after a previous guy had left, and there had been like almost a year where they didn't have like someone to lead. Like you were talking about, there used to be like one person driving this, right? They didn't have that, and like the church, they have a different idea of disciple making, I think, than I do. And I'm like, I do other things other than college, because there's only 2 full-time staff people, so like I'm doing a bunch of other things. But what would you say to like having a church culture that has the different view of like, because I think a lot of them grew up in the traditional Southern Baptist programmable discipleship, and I didn't. Like in the same way, like I sort of followed the Lord in college with like a discipleship model that's more along the lines of what we're talking about, and they don't get that. And so I'm working with like young adult, like recent grads that's what they know, like from before, and they don't really get the hands-on. Like I'm trying to lead them through like this whole year of, hey, like you need to be pouring into these people, and like trying to meet with them, and they're so I don't know, like that's not really specific.
Here's kind of a couple thoughts that I would just kind of throw your way. One is, in some ways, people always ask me, they'll say, what's the best vehicle for discipleship, right? Is it Sunday school class? Is it missional community? Is it small group? Is it mentoring? And part of my answer is, I don't care. Right? Because in some ways, the vehicle, and Ben talks about this, is like the vehicle is just to get us to where we want to get to. Right? And so in a lot of ways, what you have control, you may not have control over the vehicle, and some churches don't, of saying you have to do Sunday school, or you have to do D groups, or you have to whatever, you fill in the blank, right? But what most churches don't control is how you equip your leaders beyond that group. Right? So you can have a Sunday school class, or you can have a Sunday school class, right? You can have a Sunday school class that is like super traditional, and you can have a Sunday school class where the leaders are viewing it as discipleship, and they're engaging in a relationship for the rest of the week, right? So in a lot of ways, what I would say is like, if they're just like controlling the vehicle, whatever, like teach the people who are discipling to view it as a doorway and not the end point. Now, in that, I think that one of the things we have to do, and somebody asked this in the last question, they said, well, what practical ways can we do this? Is we have to view discipleship a little bit like teaching our kids how to ride a bike, right? There's a progression of that. You can't, like, the expectation is we either have people in our church who are 50 and 60 years old who are on training wheels still at discipleship, right? Or we just shove them on the bike and then get pissed at them because they fell down, right? We're not thinking about the progression of helping them get there. And so one of the things of saying, like, is there a way to create some frameworks for your leaders to show them what going beyond whatever the vehicle is looks like? So saying, okay, every week you're going to do Sunday school, or you're doing D group, plus here's what I want you to do. Daily, I want you to pray for everybody in your small group. Weekly, I want you to text them and encourage them and how you're praying for them. And then monthly, I want you to take them out for dinner or invite them over to your home. So you're kind of showing them, you're like almost saying, like, let me show you training wheels. Now the goal is you want to get to a point where you don't have to do that, right? Where they just can figure it out and do it. But what you're doing is you're giving them some frameworks and saying, I want to show you what engaging relationally but beyond the vehicle looks like. and then continue to show them that it can be even more than that, and they just need to be responsive to the Holy Spirit in doing that.
Say a couple comments on that too. One, I would hesitate to give people more principles to operate on if they're the kind of people who have been raised in church and are kind of what you were describing. Like, we just go to the events, we check the boxes. Because if you give them, in the biblical sense, I think that'd be like, here's another law that you have to follow.
Yeah.
And what does Paul say the law does? It causes sin to rise up in our hearts. And you might have the moralist whose sin is like, aha, I'm going to achieve that law, and now I'm prideful. Or you have the rebel who's like, screw you, man, I'm not doing that. So what I would say is, and this was really our ministry for a lot of years, it was people who were thoroughly churched, and it took years to break them of their churchy habits, to get them to the point where, like, this is our lifestyle. What I would do, if I was going to go back and restart working with similar from what I picked up from what you're saying, is I would do it with them. And like I would disciple them and say, hey, let's do it. And a key piece would be, let's get outside of the meetings and we're going to go do stuff that feels a little bit crazy to you. Like we're going to go on campus and we're going to talk to people, or we're going to go to a bar and sit around and just chat with
you. You can't say that. You're Southern Baptist. You're not a Southern Baptist. You can't tell them to do
that. But like get people out of their comfort zones and experiencing things that are like, ooh, this, because if you keep doing the same thing, you're going to get the same results. Yeah. And usually what we do in church is we try to do the same thing but better and hope to get different results. So I would like do stuff with people, get them outside their comfort zone, and then be like, hey guys, guess what we've been doing the last 6 months? This is what I've been doing. I've been discipling you. And like Jesus, taking you out into the mission field. And yeah, it hasn't been very fun at points, but what have you learned? And like work backwards and say, look, if this is what I was doing, and then, Lord willing, they'd be like, oh, it actually makes more sense than what we used to do.
Yeah, Ben was doing a teaching here a few weeks ago in Austin. We did a disciple-making culture intensive, which is like a small, like 12 people, 16 people or under. And he was talking about this idea of discipleship of being not just information, but he talked about information, imitation, and immersion. Right? A lot of times at the church, we kind of hang at the information level, but we don't get down into the imitation. So are they seeing me do it, right? So they can imitate that, and then am I putting them in immersive experiences that they have to kind of wrestle through some of those pieces of what that looks like.
Yeah, and if you have people who think they already know the information, but they actually don't, what you need to do is immerse them in a scenario where they're like, oh crap, I actually don't. Like, this is what Jesus does with his disciples all the time. Like, here's 5,000 people, you feed them. Oh crap, that's not something that's possible. And Jesus is like, okay, now watch. I'm going to show you, here's how we handle a situation when something impossible is in front of you. We pray, and God comes through and provides. And they're like, oh, okay, now I see. Now I can teach you about that, because what you thought you knew, you've now realized I didn't know it.
Yeah, that's helpful.
Is there like a healthy time? I've been lingering, this has been a lingering question for me. Like, is there a healthy time to stop meeting disciple with people? Like, say I've been meeting with a guy for a year, and they are effectively making disciples. What's the healthy boundary after a certain time? Like, I still want to meet with you, to be like, knowing you're capable and like doing this on your own. So like, do you keep meeting with them, or do you move on?
Yeah, are they wanting to move on or not wanting to move on?
They're not wanting to move on.
Okay.
But they're kind of taking your capacity and then go make more disciples. But they're totally capable of making disciples.
Yeah.
What I would say in response to that is, yes, absolutely, there's a time to move on. But I don't think it's like, all right, good, dude, you're good, see ya. Yeah. What I think it is, it's almost like a weaning process, right? If a woman's weaning her child, you don't just be like, all right, we're done. You know, you're 2 years old, now you don't need this milk anymore, you're eating solid food. It's a process where you're gradually reducing the amount that's of what they're getting. So what I would think about in a context like that is like, okay, if we're meeting weekly, hey man, I got a lot of stuff going on, I'm going to start working with this person, let's start meeting every week. And then 4 months later, hey man, you know, like, how's it going, you doing okay? Okay, we need to move to once a month, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, and I think part of that too is that I think in groups and discipleship, we don't share with people early enough our desire for them to do it, right? We kind of bait and switch them at the end. I'm like, okay, you're ready. And I'm like, whoa, I didn't agree to that, right? Versus like, hey, I'm going to meet with you for 9 months. And then at the end of that 9 months, we're going to evaluate. But my goal for you is actually that you can do this. And I'm just letting you know that now so that you understand what the expectations are. So we might get to a point and evaluate that you're not ready. But we're not going to get to the end of this thing and you're like, well, you didn't tell me that, right? I was pretty clear in the front that was the end goal of this thing. So even being able to state that on the front side.
I'll make one last comment on this because it's already, you got 2 minutes left of our time.
No, we actually go to a quarter after.
One more comment on this. I think we do too much one-on-one in discipleship. I think, actually, you look at Jesus, very rarely was he in one-on-one conversations with people that we recorded. And most of those situations are people who are in sin or kind of unique evangelistic sort of scenarios, the woman at the well, Zacchaeus, Peter when he's addressing Peter. So what I would be doing if you have a person like that where they were like, no, I can't stop meeting with you, say, awesome, all right, let's bring in someone else or 2 other people who I'm discipling, and let's bring them into this conversation so then this guy who knows more can begin actually like helping you disciple those other people. And then who knows me after a while, you can like, all right, I'm backing out.
Yeah.
These guys too.
Yeah.
Like, so yeah, I mean, one, pragmatically, you can get a lot more done. You can meet with more people that way. If you're like, I'm meeting with 3 people minimum each time, unless it's a specific issue I want to address. 2, they're going to learn more because they're hearing the struggles and wrestlings of the other people in the group. You get more perspectives. And 3, like if you're an introvert, conversation flows a little bit more when it's not just like you and that person bearing the weight of the conversation.
Yep, that's good. Okay. Let's go on to number 3 here is leader in the mission field. I'm going to go through this one a little bit quicker just because I want to make sure we get to the end, which is start something simple. A couple just kind of thoughts or understanding of what we kind of think through on this one is really beginning to help your leaders understand their strengths and their weaknesses and how God has uniquely equipped and shaped them. You think about like a passage like Ephesians 2:10, right? The good works that God has prepared in advance for us to do. And so it's really helping them discover who they are as a leader, right? And I think a lot of times we do this a little bit too late in terms of understanding our gifts, our abilities, how that, and then even how that is, I think in a lot of ways intersects with ministry, of how we're going to structure the ministry around our gifts. Because, if you're not a natural communicator and you think that a weekly communication is the vehicle for ministry, well, it's not really, right? But if you're gifted in serving or hospitality, maybe the ministry actually needs to start out with something a little bit different around those gifts versus what we think of ministry. And so I think understanding the leadership is a key thing. The second thing in this is really helping the leader be active on the mission field. And this is a thing we see so often, especially people who are vocational ministry people. Man, we hide in our office way too much. Right? We don't get out on campus. We're not around the mission field. I've encouraged a couple people I was coaching who had dual roles, like they were student ministries and college ministry as well. And I just said, man, you got a community college. What if one day a week you just officed at the community college, sit in the commons, do your normal work, understand you're probably not going to be as productive as you want to be. But then in between classes, as people are walking by, you're recognizing students, you're talking to them, you're listening, you're there, you're present, like where they're at. If you do a discipleship thing, do it on campus, do it in a coffee shop. Like, don't have them come to your house necessarily or to, the church, but be on location where they're in the mission field. And so I think part of it is that we really need to move and get ourselves out into the mission field. So understanding our gifts, understanding the mission field that we need to engage that, and also understanding of how those things shape our ministry moving forward.
So any questions on that piece, leader in mission field? Pretty straightforward, I think. Not necessarily easy. Yeah, go ahead.
Question, though. How do you, I guess, know what your people are gifted in?
Good question. Yeah, there's a lot of great resources out there. Like practically, there's tools like Strengths Finder, which is a test by the book test, and so there's stuff like that, or the Enneagram, DISC test, Myers-Briggs. Those are all tools that kind of help identify through assessments gifting, strengths, abilities, and those are useful. I think the best way to do it, though, is in the context of community. Like probably if you have a group of people that you're friends with, you guys know who's good at what. You're like, man, you are really organized. And like you keep everyone else on track, and this guy over here, he's never on track. So you're always frustrated with him. So if in the context of a community, you're probably going to pick up on those things. What's I think really important is to be able to articulate those things, because oftentimes we don't take the time to pause and be like, man, Steve, you are really good at starting conversations with new people. And I'm terrified of that, but you do that really well. So, hey, Steve, maybe what you should do, maybe your role in our community gathering is you go and meet the new people. Like, so I'll give an example. My wife and I are wired very differently. She's an introvert. I love working the room and meeting new people. And like, I have this, I can't turn it off. It's almost annoying sometimes, where I pick up like this person over here is standing by themselves, awkward and uncomfortable, and they don't feel like they are connected to the group. So I'm like trying to talk with this person, but I can't ignore that one. Whereas my wife gets overwhelmed in a big group of people and would much rather have an hour-long conversation with one person about something deep and meaningful. And I get energized by having like 5-minute conversations with 15 people and feeling like, man, everyone felt like they met someone and felt connected. And we figured that out in the context of our relationship and other friendships. So there's tools that you can use to identify that, but probably what's going to be most fruitful and meaningful is if you have a community like, and we did this in an intensive, and it was like powerful, where people were like tearing up and crying as we did this. We just said, hey, you guys who have been friends for, many of them for like 10 or 15 years, they grew up in a similar church together, let's take a half hour and go around the room and tell each other, hey, this is what I see in you. You're good at this thing, or here's something I value about you. And they were like, man, we've never done that before. We've known each other for years. And that could be a transformative thing for a group. And that's doing the work of helping people articulate, here's what I'm gifted at. So final piece in the process. So this, what we're doing here is we're just walking through the milestones that we have in what we call stage 0. So stage 0, going back to the metaphor we talked about this morning, if you're building a house, you don't start with building a house by putting up a roof and buying furniture. I don't know, maybe you're the kind of person who wants to buy your furniture before you build your house, but that's probably not the best choice. The first step, most people, when I ask that question, what's the first step? You buy a plot of land, build a house. Most people say lay the foundation. That's not actually the first step. If you buy land, you need to survey the land. You need to prepare the ground. You need to remove any trees, or maybe there's some rocks, or maybe it's a boggy area and you need to backfill it with some solid ground so that your house doesn't sink. You got to prepare the ground. Stage 0 for us, that's preparing the ground. So it's not until step number 4, milestone number 4 in stage 0, that you actually start a ministry. And I put that in quotation marks because from the outside, most people might look at what you're doing and be like, man, where's the ministry, man? We wanted a college ministry. It's been 6 months. Why is there not 20 college students coming to our church? This is the point where you begin starting something that probably looks a little bit more like what people would label as, oh, now we have a college ministry or a young adult ministry. The temptation is to start with this. And what happens when we do that, almost inevitably, is the thing that you start actually begins to choke out discipleship. Because if you start a weekly worship gathering, especially in a Christian context, we're so drawn to the event that, oh, now we have this event going, and that just sucks everyone's energy into that thing. And then disciple making kind of withers away. And that's why we have this as number 4. So when we start something, here's what we mean. We mean something structured, something outward focused, and something that supports disciple making. So structured means it's not just sporadic or random. There's intentionality around it. And maybe it's, hey, we do this thing once a quarter. We do this thing once a month. there's purpose and intentionality behind it. So we're going to start something that's simple. There's going to be a structure and intentionality behind it. Number two, it's outward focused. One of the pieces of our philosophy of ministry, you can disagree with this if you want, but I think the church exists not for the church. The church exists to reach the world with the gospel. So your thing that you start at the outset should not, if you're doing discipleship, you're taking people who are believers, or hopefully there's some new believers in that mix, deep into Scripture, deep into the gospel, and applying that to their lives. The thing that you should start should not be all right, now we're going to get all the Christians together and do more of the exact same thing that we're doing in our discipleship space. Instead, this should be something that says, how do we create something that's actually going to enable us to reach more people on our campus, in our city? So that might mean, instead of your college ministry starts with, we do ultimate Frisbee on campus on Saturday afternoon, and that's our ministry. That's where we're starting. And then afterwards, the people that we're discipling, we're saying, hey, invite people to come afterwards, and we're going to do a Saturday evening Bible study or something like that. You figure out, based on your context, you're going to have to figure out what that looks like, but something outward focused. And lastly, that's something that supports disciple making. We've been talking about that, so I won't reiterate that. And the last piece we have here is the together piece. And this is important. This is a great place, rather than letting that thing suck energy away from discipleship, let it be an opportunity to begin to train up leaders. Like Andy said earlier, discipleship precedes leadership. Starting something simple together means I've discipled these people. This is a great chance for me to invite them to come along and help me create this thing. So rather than you going and doing it as the point leader, you should be bringing people with you to do this as another layer of discipleship. And Lord willing, as you start something, the people are going to take steps forward. Like maybe the person who's really organized, they just can't help but organize and want to make sure that everyone understands and has been communicated to about the time and the place you're meeting. You say, wow, you're actually pretty good at that. Why don't you take this on? And that doesn't mean you have to be like, aha, now you're the leader, because probably that's going to scare someone away. I've seen that happen over and over again. You put the label leadership on it, and people are like, I can't do it. You're like, actually, you've been doing this for the last 6 months. We just never called you a leader. So that's the together pieces. You're inviting people to shape this thing and create this thing with you that you have been discipling. And Andy mentioned this in the last piece, is that hopefully if you've been discipling those people, there's a level of trust and relationship that you have with them where they're going to say, I'm bought into this, and I'm going to invite other people into this thing because I value the relationship that we have, and I want other people to experience that. One last comment on this is on the simplicity piece, is that we have a tendency to want to do too much too quickly. So two things we think about. I think less frequent and less complex. If you're doing something simple, it should be relatively infrequent and relatively not complex. The more frequent it is and the more complex it is, the more likely it is to drown out discipleship. So think about what are the things that are simple, fun, energizing for you. If you're preaching a sermon every week, that's probably fairly complex, unless you're really gifted, and that's dude, I love studying Scripture and I love teaching. Awesome. Then that's maybe what your something simple looks like, is you prepping and just doing the overflow of your own personal Bible study and communicating to that people. But if that's not your gifting, that's going to be something complex for you, unless you have someone else in your team now who's been developed to the point where they enjoy doing that. Final thing I'll say. A really helpful metaphor. I don't think I said this already in this session. If I did, oh well, it's good enough to repeat. We tend to confuse the vehicle with the destination, right? We talked about the vehicle of disciple making. It doesn't really matter what it is. What matters is the destination. It would be silly if I was to say, man, if I'm going on vacation to Florida and you asked me where I was going on vacation, and I said, I'm going on Delta Airlines. I'm going to Delta Airlines for vacation. That's dumb. Why are you doing that? No one wants to sit on an airline. But if it would make sense, right? If I'm taking an airplane to get to Florida, that's the vehicle that I'm using to get to that destination. But we have this serious challenge in the church world where people confuse the vehicle with the destination. So I go to small group. I go to Sunday morning. I go to the midweek service. And that's how I grow spiritually. No, That's the vehicle that's taking you to the destination of being a disciple of Jesus. So I think it's important for us when you get to this point, if you're starting something, that you need to be really crystal clear with your people. This is the vehicle. It's not the destination.